Hello, my name is Steve Tilson. I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about the presidency of John Kennedy. You may remember that Kennedy, he was the victor in what we referred to earlier as the first TV election. He was perceived as young and glamorous and this great liberal new figure in American politics and in American culture. I would submit to you that that's a little bit overblown. I think Kennedy is really more of a pragmatic. He did push some liberal policies. Notably, he was the first president to really fairly overtly push the idea of civil rights for minorities, specifically African American people. He had some other pieces of legislation that vaguely were New Deal-ish, minimum wage laws, things like that. He was not, if you go back and look at what he actually was able to accomplish, he was not all that terribly effective. Congress at this point, Congress in the early 60s, was controlled by conservatives, both Republican and Democrat. And so the amount of legislation that Kennedy was actually able to get passed is really fairly limited. One of the things that he was very interested in doing, the Democrats had been charged on occasion with being soft on communism. And he was very interested in showing that he was not soft on communism. So he was very interested in showing himself as someone who could be tough and strong in international relations. He went to Vienna not long after his election in 1961. He went to Vienna and had a series of talks with Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. He didn't fare all that well. Khrushchev is an interesting figure in history too. We look back now from the perspective of a few decades. Khrushchev represents a fairly dramatic departure from the old-style Soviet leadership. Of course, Stalin himself was something of a psychopath. He would never have taken part in international talks. He stayed behind the scenes and sort of manipulated things. Khrushchev was a showman. He was a showman. He liked to be out in front. He liked the cameras. He liked the publicity. He was always one for the grand gesture, banging his shoe on the desk at the UN and all sorts of things like that. He was a bit of a showman, and so at Vienna he was the bully, and he sort of pushed JFK around a little bit. Kennedy was, as I say, he felt like he had to prove something, perhaps. Not long after these Vienna talks, by the way, the Berlin Wall started going up. The city of Berlin in East Germany Berlin is in East Germany, the eastern part of the country, which was controlled by the Soviets at that point, separate country, East Germany versus West Germany. And traffic between the two halves of Berlin, East and West Berlin, had been relatively free up to that point, and the Soviets were getting nervous about that. So in '61, they started building the wall, which would go up and would be there for a couple of decades. So tensions were sort of going up a bit. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, they did make some changes. They moved away from the old policy of mutually assured destruction, which had been Eisenhower and Dulles' basic foreign policy. They were reacting to a new situation in the world, and this is an important point. The 1960s, the early 1960s, we have tended traditionally to see this and this whole period in terms of the Cold War. It's all about us versus the Russians, and everything that happened in the world is pushed into that lens. But there was a lot of things going on in the world at that time, and many of them actually didn't have that much directly to do with the Cold War and the East-West confrontation. A major thing that was going on, in fact, which had huge implications for world history in general, was this was the period when several of the old European colonial empires were finally being dismantled. We throw around the phrases First World, Second World, and particularly Third World fairly freely. You might not know that these phrases were first used in the context of the Cold War. The First World was the West, the United States and its allies. The Second World was the Soviet Union and its allies. The Third World was basically everybody else. It has come to refer to the less developed, less industrialized, less wealthy and cosmopolitan parts of the world, countries of the world. And as I say, it first began to be used during this period in the 60s, and it referred to, in many cases, these countries that were former colonial possessions, but which were now asserting and gaining independence. And they were not going along with this notion that they had to fit themselves into this East-West confrontation. Some of them did end up on one side or the other to some degree or other, but a lot of them simply said, no, we're not interested in that. We are independent and we're going to go our own way. So the East-West confrontation in the Cold War began to take on some interesting new characteristics. And as I was saying, Kennedy did make some efforts to respond to that. John Kennedy started the Peace Corps. This was an organization, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Peace Corps. We send volunteers out to various parts of the world, less industrialized, developing, emerging parts of the world, to help folks to better their conditions of living. This was a very direct response to what was seen in those days as a very real communist threat. That is, they could make a direct appeal to less developed, less wealthy parts of the world, and this was a response, a counter to that. He also created a program sort of like the Peace Corps. This one was specifically for Latin America, the Alliance for Progress. Excuse me, and he also developed a military manifestation of this same idea, this non-traditional kinds of responses to new conditions and new situations. John Kennedy started the Special Forces, and he put them in a little bit of a special new uniform, an elite force, the Green Berets, and they were specifically trained and prepared to operate in situations that were not traditional, not conventional, but to counter the kinds of insurgency that the communists were quite good at, and which they were trying to do in a number of places in the world. So we're talking about the situation here where countries who had been in a situation of being aligned with one or the other of the colonial powers, or one or the other of the two big East-West alliances, sort of coming out of that and asserting their independence. A classic illustration of this, not the only one, but a classic illustration of it, is Cuba. A country that is once more back in the headlines, by the way, very recently. But the situation in Cuba going into the 1960s, Cuba had, you remember, had been part of the old Spanish colonial empire for centuries. It was removed from Spanish control after a long and very bloody sort of revolution and freedom struggle there in Cuba. It was taken away from the Spanish in 1898 when we had the war with Spain. There's a whole interesting story there too. The American public opinion was deeply divided as to whether the United States should even be in the business of collecting colonial possessions. We ended up with some, but there was a specific amendment in Congress saying that we would not take Cuba as an actual possession. So Cuba was never a political possession. It was never politically controlled by the United States. Now, economically, it was totally dominated by the United States. Of course, it's very close, less than 100 miles away, right off the shore of Florida down there. In the early 20th century, Cuba had gone through a whole series of less than desirable political situations. By the late 50s, there was basically a sort of military dictator there, a man named Batista. He was a pretty unsavory character, ruled with a very heavy hand, very oppressive. Anybody who said anything different got thrown in jail, if not executed. He was, however, very right-wing, strongly anti-communist, so he got American backing. But conditions under Batista had been declining, and there had grown up a fairly widespread popular resistance, a revolutionary movement. In 1959, there was a revolution in Cuba that overthrew the Batista government and replaced it with a new regime. This regime was headed by a charismatic revolutionary who had been a minor league baseball player in the United States as a younger man, Fidel Castro. Now, we don't remember a lot these days, but there was a brief period of time, a few months or so, right after the Castro Revolution in 1959. You might call it a sort of a honeymoon, when nobody knew exactly what Castro's politics were. They knew that he had been the leader of this revolution that overthrew Batista, and actually the Eisenhower government in its last few weeks there were making friendly overtures to Castro, and then it came out that he had been in contact with agents of the Soviet Union, and he had developed some leftist leanings, and of course that ended the honeymoon very quickly. And he began, basically because he had little choice, he began to rely on the Soviet Union for help and support, and he got it. The American government, of course, was interested in ending this. This made everybody here very nervous to have a communist power less than 100 miles off our shores. The CIA got in contact with some of the people who had left Cuba at the time of the Castro Revolution, who, for whatever set of reasons, did not feel comfortable staying there under this new regime, under this new government. And they put together a scheme to topple Castro's government. As I say, these Cuban exiles were heavily armed and supported by the CIA. They expected, apparently, to get even more active U.S. military, direct military support in their attempt. That did not happen when in 1961, now under the Kennedy administration, the CIA plan was put into effect, and there was an attempted invasion, a place called the Bay of Pigs. It was a debacle, basically. It was a total failure. The invaders were routed, a number of them killed, others captured, rounded up, and thrown into custody. It was a PR disaster. We looked bad. This sort of set the scene then for what was going on. As I say, the Cuban government, the Castro government, was leaning heavily on the Soviet Union for support. They were getting it in '62. Apparently, the Russians decided that what they would try to do is surreptitiously slip into Cuba nuclear weapons, missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads. We found out about this. They didn't have spy satellites in those days, but they had spy planes. And we found out about the missiles being in Cuba. Presented the Russians with an ultimatum: get them out or face the consequences. At the time that this was done, there were actually already Russian ships, more Russian ships on the way to Cuba, carrying more missiles. And in October of 1962, for a few days, there was what has come down in history as the missile crisis. The Soviet ships getting closer and closer, American naval units getting closer and closer to them, people in Washington and Moscow sitting tensely by the fabled big red button. What was going to happen, nobody knew. Who was going to back down? Was nobody going to back down? Could this, in fact, turn into World War III? As I say, for a few hours there in '62, in October of '62, things were pretty tense. Eventually, what happened? The Soviets blinked. The Soviet vessels turned back. Everybody breathed a sigh of relief. Ironically, in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was actually lessened somewhat. It's been suggested that people were so scared that they were very interested in coming up with ways to lessen the tension. One of the things that happened right after the missile crisis, it came out during that crisis that there was actually no direct synchronous communication between the White House and the Kremlin, the center of government for the Soviet Union. So in the aftermath of the missile crisis, what became known as the hotline was created, a direct telephone link between the White House and the Soviet leadership, so that at any time it became necessary or advisable, they could actually talk directly. A little bit later on, there was a test ban agreed to so that we weren't testing new nuclear weapons, and the Soviets agreed not to do so as well. So ironically, kind of out of a very tense situation emerged somewhat lessening of international tension. Thanks.